Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I am Christine Dixon of The Ordinary Sacred, and I'm going to take a little pause in my exploration of Martha Sweezy's wonderful book on shame and guilt to do a special episode on unattached burdens, which can be a bit of a controversial topic. And I've actually been wanting to do this video on unattached burdens for about 6 months, but in my exploration and my experience, it was such a roller coaster that I wanted to come to a place where I felt I had processed it and there was peace and clarity around it before I shared. And if you're not sure what an unattached burden is, an unattached burden is the word that Dick Schwartz, the founder of Internal Family Systems, uses for any entity or kind of spiritual force that comes into a person's system that is not part of them. And so you might think of demons and angels. It can be malevolent or benevolent. And you can see why this is a little bit of a controversial topic. Dick Schwartz himself has great concern, even though he absolutely has observed unattached burdens, or what are called UBs. And he talks about them, but his concerns that he wrote in the foreword of Bob Falconer's book, who has recently done a lot of work with UBs and has written books and done trainings. He wrote his concerns in the foreword there. And one of them is that he believes, it could potentially discredit internal family systems therapy. I personally don't think that it will do that. But his second concern that I really get is that the whole focus of internal family systems is on non-shaming, non-pathologizing, right? Going toward parts that appear really severe, really extreme, even bad, evil, right? Like suicidal parts, critics, and getting down, understanding that their intention is actually good, is such an important aspect of IFS. So his fear is if we just start seeing unattached burdens or demons everywhere and try to cast them out, we have the potential of trying to get rid of very valuable parts of ourselves. And so I very much resonate with that concern. And you'll see that as I explain my own personal journey here. Now, whenever I share my personal journey, it's never a prescription for you. It's very possible for me to have a very valid experience and for you to have an equally valid, different experience. So a lot of our parts, try to make it either or, black or white, kind of competition. But I myself absolutely does not see it that way. We can all have very different experiences and they can all be very true and valid for us. So if I share something that's different than your experience, it's not a challenge to you at all. Okay, so first I just want to share a little bit of my own personal history because it will inform going forward some of my views. So many of you know I grew up in a very religious, conservative Christian home. My father was a pastor. And so he's a religious leader. And in that institution, there was this belief in angels and demons, and a belief that Jesus would cast out demons or had done that. However, in the tradition I grew up, when it was kind of seen as in the past, and we would kind of look at, we considered ourselves very rational, and we would look at the charismatics and the Pentecostals who were speaking in tongues and the gifts of the Spirit and casting out demons as a little bit loopy, right? And I remember in junior high and high school, there was this kind of traveling pastor that would go around and he would see the occult everywhere, right? I remember him saying it was bad to wear a t-shirt with the peace sign on it, or of course you couldn't listen to these heavy metal songs that had backward masking talking about Satan, and you couldn't do yoga, or you would be inviting in demons or meditate, those kinds of things. So it seemed like very fear-based, and at my core, I very much rejected that. So that was some of my background. Another thing to add is that as a child, and still now, I'm very sensitive. And so I absolutely put a boundary with any type of scary horror film, any kind of movie like that. If I was at a sleepover and friends were watching The Exorcist or Friday the 13th or something like that, I would unapologetically go to another room by myself for those couple hours. Usually hang out with their parents or something. And so I don't have that imagery in my head. Of course, I know what those movies were kind of about, but I think the scariest movie I ever saw as a kid was Piranha. So I don't have those images in my mind, and I'm protected in a sense from that. Okay, so the last experience I want to share with you from my history was that when I lived in Istanbul, Turkey, we were part of a Turkish church that was actually quite charismatic and Pentecostal. And we went on a retreat with them. And I remember we were staying in this little room to the side of the main meeting room. And one night, and I was pregnant, I was very pregnant at the time. And I remember I had to use the restroom. I had to pee so bad. And they were trying to do this exorcism in the main room. And so I could just hear this going on, and they were just fighting and fighting with this demon to come out of this woman. And I remember being on the other side of the door going, please, please come out of her quickly. I need to pee. I just remember being so frustrated, wanting to burst open the door and say, okay, could you take this somewhere else? So again, even in that moment, I didn't take it very seriously. Though I do remember people who absolutely did. All right. So fast forward to about 6 months ago. Again, before that, I had heard Dick talk about unattached burdens, and that can be malevolent or benevolent as guides, right? But, really hadn't thought much about it or done any kind of work with UBs and myself or anyone else. So about 6 months ago is when Bob Falconer's book, The Porous Mind, came out. And there was a lot of buzz about UBs, and I decided to read the book, which I did. And the beginning, he talks about the whole history of, every time, every culture, every religion has some kind of aspect of spiritual beings that visit us or we experience that can be malevolent or benevolent. And then he gives a whole guide on how to work with these. And he talks about his own experience of how it just kind of fell upon him to help someone who had this unattached burden. And he's kind of now become the go-to person for this. And I think particularly because he's not afraid of it, which is a prerequisite to work with this. And so I read the book, and then right about that time, Derek Scott of IFS Canada put out a video. And it was funny. There was like this disclaimer you had to click on and sign. And it was very, I don't know, a lot of intrigue around it. But I watched this video of Bob Falconer working with an unattached burden with one of Derek Scott's assistants. And I just found it fascinating. I found it powerful. I took notes on it. I thought this seems pretty straightforward. I feel like this is something I could probably do in my own system and perhaps help others do. So I decided to get curious in my own system. And I thought, I wonder if I have or have ever had an unattached burden of this kind of malevolent kind. And many of you may have seen my video on a part that I have called Gollum, which is a very, very harsh inner critic. So this was my first exploration into unattached burdens. And it was on the heels of watching that video and reading the book. It was just an experiment. Because what had happened is I had unburdened Gollum, I had unburdened the part that he protected, which was the day of my first husband's suicide. And that had taken weeks to a month to unburden that part, but she was unburdened and free and peaceful and happy. But still, for at that point, maybe going on a year and a half, Gollum seemed unburdened. He appeared at first like Gollum of Lord of the Rings, like a demon kind of character. And he had transformed into this koala bear. But his go-to phrase, what he would say to me or to other parts of me inside, was, "You're a fucking piece of shit." And excuse the language, I don't speak like that in normal life. So it's interesting that, but this was the phrase I was hearing inside of me all the time. Now, this was something that my first husband would say to me frequently. I was in a very abusive marriage in my first marriage. And I did not really have that internal lashing, is what it feels like. When Gollum would come in, like, "You fucking piece of shit." It was like it felt like almost like a smack across the face, like a lash. And I didn't have that inside before my first husband. So, and there was this understanding that Gollum had taken on some energy from my first husband, and he had attachment to him and some of that kind of thing. But he really did seem to have a good intention, because he would come in, he explained, anytime he felt like other parts of me were trying to rescue or caretake another person, because he would say, "You tried to do that with your first husband. It didn't work. Do not try it again." And so it was like a punishment, like, stop it. But after the whole unburdening, I still continued to get this phrase in me, like over and over, "You fucking piece of shit." Right. And so I wasn't as bothered by it. I would kind of just go, "Oh, hey, Gollum, you're here. Tell me what you're concerned about." But he didn't seem to relax so much. Right. So I had this curiosity. Maybe I wonder if Gollum could be a UB. Right. And you'll see. You'll see what happens. But so I did write all of this down, but I can't find it in my notes. I have another one that I'm going to read to you that I wrote down. But with Gollum, what happened was I asked him directly if he was a part of me, and he kind of skirted away from the question, but he eventually said, "Sort of. I'm sort of a part of you." So I was like, okay. And I asked him, if he was attached to my first husband. He said yes. He did say that he came into my system at the moment of my first husband's death by suicide. And so I said, "Ooh, okay, so that sounds like it could be some kind of UB." I asked him if he wanted to leave the system and return to my first husband. He kind of indicated, he said yes, essentially. And so I sent him like into the light to go be, it was not it was not a scary situation or anything like that. And I was just wanting to observe, okay, what happens now? What's going to happen to my system? Is this phrase that lashes me going to go away? What happened was very interesting. So the weeks that followed after that, every now and then I would get this, it would say the phrase, but with a completely different energy. It was like, "You fucking piece of shit." Right. And so it didn't feel at all like Gollum. And so I turned toward it and I would say, "Who is this?" And apparently it was younger parts who missed Gollum and said that they were trying to mimic him and pretend to be him. And so that was really interesting. So I said, "Okay, I think I didn't get your permission, or perhaps that was what he was attached to. I don't know." So I ended up calling Gollum back. And what I discovered, to make a long story short, is essentially, I think it's very much like a legacy burden, that a large percentage of his energy was from my first husband and was not mine, but a very small percentage was mine. And so I brought him back, and we just released the part that let it go back to my first husband. So in many ways, if you're familiar with legacy burdens, it was very much like that. And I hadn't asked, because I was so in the track of a UB, I hadn't asked what percentage of your burden is from my first husband or is me. But the system always shows you, right? You just observe and ask and get curious, and you can bring a burden back, and you can say, okay, let's explore it more. Let's get clear about this, and let's repair it. Okay, so that was the first experience, and it was kind of, you can tell, different, right? So I wasn't comfortable really sharing it yet. And then after that, I actually had several IFS practitioners who had taken Bob Falconer's training on UBs come to me, and they had a very common experience, at least the ones who came to me, saying that the training had just terrified them, felt like it re-traumatized them. They did have this commonality that they had been exposed at a young age to horror films and to imagery of exorcisms that were very scary to them. And so they had parts that were very afraid. They were very afraid that they had UBs, a lot of fear going on. And so I started to feel very apprehensive about what Bob was doing. And like, is this causing more harm than good, in a sense? I actually worked one-on-one with a couple people around this, and really did end up finding that the parts that they thought were UBs were not UBs. They were just presenting in a way to try to protect them. And there were a lot of younger, fearful parts in them. And again, it did point to parts in them that needed loving attention. So it was not bad in that sense. But it really felt like the training traumatized them in many ways. So I started feeling like, oh, I don't even know if I want to talk about this, because I don't want that to happen. I don't want to be the cause of that. But then the next thing that happened was I ended up, now some of you may have watched the video also of me working with a suicidal part that was completely unburdened. It's kind of like, originally I thought I had one really big inner critic. Come to find out, I have 4 big inner critics that are in charge of kind of different things, and they have parts underneath them that work for them. And I thought before, oh, I have one suicidal part. Dick talked about there being kind of 2 types of suicidal parts, and I thought, well, I have this one, the murderous one, right? And I had worked with that and what it protected, and had been like kind of free of those kinds of thoughts for years. But then I experienced something that was that I had experienced before, but was different. It was a different kind of suicidal part. Because before, what I actually realize now is that the dynamic before was that there was such a big inner critic inside of me that it caused so much pain and turmoil and despair for my younger parts, that there was a part that came in and was like, maybe we should just die, because it's so unbearable to experience the harsh inner critic, right? Which was Gollum and Anubis and some other inner critics that were just pummeling the system all the time. So the part that wanted to get out was saying, your younger parts can't handle this harshness all the time, this abuse, inner abuse. And so once I went and worked with the younger parts, and I worked with the critics, that was solved. But then I started experiencing this overwhelming, it felt like an urge, but almost like something other than me was pulling me toward self-harm. Like, and I want to give a warning here. If any of this kind of talk about suicidal parts is activating for you, please take care of yourself, and don't watch if it's too much. Really be discretionary about this. This particular part wanted to pull me, like I'd be in the car and it would say, like, open the door and throw yourself out of the car, of a moving car, on the freeway, or there's a knife, grab it, and hurt yourself, or pull your hair, or just really like in these strong impulse to hurt myself. But the rest of my system was not on board with it. It was like really, really fighting it. No, 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 right? It felt like an external thing. Okay, so I'm going to tell you about my experience with this one, which later we'll find wanted to be called the tormentor. Not to be confused with the tormentor that Dick Schwartz talks about. So I got really curious about it, and it was saying you don't deserve to live, and just like I said, had this really strong impulse to do things to hurt me. And I tried to notice where I felt it in and around my body, and it was around my throat. If there felt like a cloud in my throat and my head and my arms, and my eyes were kind of squinting, and the impulse seemed to come from my chest area. And I checked how I felt toward this one, and I felt very fearful of it. So I asked the ones who were fearful if they wanted to go to another room so that I, the self, could get curious, and they agreed. They went to another room. And so again, I observed this, basically suicidal impulse. And it was a black moving cloud. I asked it to come in front of me. And I wrote here that it had buckles. I don't know what that means exactly, but it had talons, and its hands were made of metal, had a very ominous, overwhelming energy. And then at that point, I had a blocking part that just took me out into blankness. And I assured that part that I was bigger than this thing, and that whatever I'm afraid of inside cannot hurt me. And the blank part let me go again toward this ominous energy. And so I felt curious, and I asked this black cloud, what do you do? And it said, I push, I prod, I urge to self-destruct. And I said, as self, I said, yes, and you're very good at that. And the part bowed. And I said, why? Why do you do that? And then it appeared as a witch face with purple hair, and it was laughing, and it just said, I just do it. And I felt curious because, at least in the last time, it did seem like there was an activator, which was whenever I would be required to be hospitable, to cook and clean and hostess other people, and felt really inadequate in that. Like, that seemed to be the stimulus for when this part came up the last time. So I asked if that was when it came up, and it said, I come up where there are other parts who already feel shame, and then I encourage them further and further in it. I exploit them. And it started laughing. And I said, why do you exploit them? And it said, because I want to play with them. I said, oh, I see. I said, is it fun for you? And the part said yes, or this thing said yes. And I said, do you realize that other parts are very afraid of you and the impulse you bring for destruction? And he said, it had a male energy, so I'm going to say he said, yes, it's like scaring children in a haunted house. It's fun. And then a polarized part came in. It was like, how is that fun? That is not fun. That's sadistic. And I asked that part to give me space so I could continue to go forward without judgment, and with curiosity. And I said, how is it fun for you? And he said, it's like a carnival. There's a lot of drama and energy and fear. And I said, and then it turned into an image of it like a trickster. And I said, do you hold Ronald, my first husband's energy? And he said, no. I said, okay. And I said, is there something that you would like to be called? And he didn't say anything. And I said, what about tormentor or tormentor? And he said, yes, I like that. That's what I am. And then I got an image. When I was growing up, they had this thing called Knott's Scary Farm. It was an amusement park called Knott's Berry Farm, but during Halloween, they would make Knott's Scary Farm. I actually never went, I don't think, but I did see them preparing for it, and there were these monsters. So it looked like a monster from that. And I said, do you care that the other parts suffer? And it said yes and no. And then it said, I don't like that the other parts they try to suppress me. And I said, oh, I said, yeah, that's true. They do. They want you to go away. I said, but what if you could come up in a more moderate form? And then it shifted image into a clown. So at this point, I'm thinking, oh, maybe it's a part, right? Maybe it does have some positive intention. It's just wanting to be funny. Thinks it's funny. And I said, what is your biggest fear? And it said that I'll be banished. And then I said, how old do you think I am? And it said 5. And then I got this clear image of going to the circus with my aunt growing up. And then I had this recollection of my uncle being there, who was quite a torturer for me as a kid. He would do all kinds of mean and cruel things to me. And what's interesting is I've had 3 people die by suicide in my life: my uncle, Lonnie, my cousin, Derek, and then my first husband, Ronald. So that was an interesting imagery. And then I updated and I said, I'm 48. And he started laughing and slapping his knee. Thought that was funny. And because I had gotten this image of my Uncle Lonnie, I said, do you carry the energy of my Uncle Lonnie? And he said, yes, and started laughing. And then there was a part that freaked out, got really afraid from that. And so I had to give that part some attention and put it in a safe space so that it could give me some space. And so then I asked directly, did you come into me after my Uncle Lonnie died? And it said, yes. And again, it's laughing a lot. And said, oh, you're catching on, little one. And I said, are you attached to other parts of me? And he said, yes, to the little pathetic wee bitty ones. They're so helpless. So then this was interesting. It felt kind of like, in hindsight, it felt like a diversion. I went to the little ones and was trying to tend to them, but they seemed to indicate that they were not attached to him. They didn't like him at all, but that they were not attached to him. And then at that moment, I have a 10-year-old part that I know very well that came out, Chrissy, and she said that she experienced a lot of trauma at 10, and that's what created the opening for him to come in. And at that point, I had this big aha, and I was like, of course it's a 10-year-old part, because I was 10 years old when my Uncle Lonnie died. But I was just thrown off because he was saying it was a wee little one, which I interpreted it as younger, I guess, than 10. So I went back to kind of the trauma moment, which I've already gone back and retrieved and unburdened Chrissy, the 10-year-old part. And she's now Flower Girl and all of that. And so it was interesting. I went back there and she wasn't there, but it was like there was this shadow of her still stuck there, which was interesting. And I went to the shadow and I said, are you the tormentor? And he shriveled up a bit and he said, yes, it's me, but I'm just trying to have fun. And I said, is anyone else attached to you? And it seemed kind of like the 10-year-old really wasn't attached to him anymore, but he was just still there. The younger ones, the 10-year-old felt very securely attached to me. He, as I talked to him, he also explained that Gollum had been kind of a sidekick for him, that they kind of worked together. And then, so this part, it's interesting, is like a trickster. So I feel like he kept leading me down these different paths that were kind of like distractions. So I said, are there any other parts you're attached to? And he said, the back left side of your head. So I said, okay. And then it said, this is what keeps you connected to anybody in the news that you find out has died by suicide. But it kept me connected in a really painful, oppressive way, right? Like Robin Williams or Twitch recently, those kinds of things. Often when I find that out, I'll kind of be down and out for a few days. So I said, are you willing to release that in order to help the system? You can still feel compassion, but release that darkness, that oppressiveness. And then there were other parts that were like, please, please, please release it. And I asked them to just give space and be patient. And then the trickster came out again and said, ha ha, it's me, it's still me. And so basically admitting like that he was also behind this. And so then I did something that Bob Falconer talks about doing just as an experiment. I kind of like encapsulated him, the tormentor, in a ball of light. And he looked kind of like a jester, and he was trying to break out. And I said, you're not attached anymore to any of these parts, and they're securely attached to me. So this kind of dark, oppressive nature is no longer wanted in my system. I was just very calm and confident with him. I said, so you need to leave. And if you can go to the light or you can go to the dark. And it was interesting, as I was doing this, the sun came out from behind the clouds and like came through the window really strong. So I got this sense. I said, do you want to go to the light? And he said, yes. I said, do you want to go back to Lonnie? He said, no. I said, it's your choice where you go. And he said he wanted to go to Derek, to my cousin who also died by suicide. And I said, okay, that works. And so then the light came in and kind of like vacuumed him. And the sun just kept getting brighter and brighter outside my window, which was really interesting. And then, Bob often says that when this happens, to just check around and see if there are any benevolent guides that want to come in. And so I asked, and there was this, it kind of looked like the Glenda the Good Witch. And she said, I'm the matron of hospitality, and I will help your parts that feel stressed about hospitality. I will help them relax and help them see their own worth so that they can just reflect others' worth. And it seemed very benevolent, and haven't had any problems with her since then. So that was essentially what happened in my second go. And since then, I have not had any kind of impulse like that. I also have not had that lashing of, you effing piece of shit, from Gollum since. So this has been a good 6 months or so. So again, that's my experience, and I'll just kind of end with some of my conclusions about this. One of the things that in my experience with this and observing others is, I wonder if unattached burden is not really the right word for it, because they are attached. And I think, or maybe Bob Falconer's book is called The Ones Inside or something like that. Or no, that's not what they're called. It's called, I'm sorry. Do I have it here? Oh, it's called The Others Within Us: Internal Family Systems, Porous Mind, and Spirit Possession. Okay, so the others within us. And Yeah. So the reason why I think maybe unattached is not right, because Bob will say that these entities are attached to other parts, that they often come in when we're at our most vulnerable, when we've just experienced a trauma, when we feel like we need power or perhaps companionship, can come in during psychedelic experiences, and just really heavy losses and things like that, traumas. So, and they attach to our most vulnerable parts, right? So they are actually attached. And the last thing, that most recent thing, is that I listened to IFS Talks podcast interview with Bob Falconer, and I just resonated with everything he said. At first, when people were saying that they came away so fearful after his training, and I completely, for the record, believe them, and wonder if he presented things that maybe he wasn't afraid of, but wasn't sensitive to the fact that it could be kind of traumatizing for people. But what he said in this interview was, whatever you're afraid of in the system, you're not going to be able to help. And so if you're a practitioner and you are afraid of UBs, please refer out to someone else. Don't try to do it yourself. There's no bad thing about you. You don't have a responsibility to do this, right? If you do have really fearful parts around these things, for whatever reason, because you've had this history with horror films, exorcisms, things like that, you don't need to do it, and that's okay. The other thing he said that resonated with me is that the process with UBs is exactly the same as classic IFS. He said, you assume it's a part, you assume it's a part, you assume it's a part, over and over and over. And you get layer upon layer upon layer, you ask questions to try to get to its good intention. And if it does not have a good intention, when you've asked and asked and asked, and it becomes very clear that it doesn't have good intention, then you might treat it as a UB. But even so, there is no fighting. There's no fighting energy like you see in exorcisms or, in the movies, those kinds of things. That's where he feels like some of that has gotten it wrong. He said when you're in self, you have this loving, compassionate energy, even toward what seems like this evil, demonic, in the case of a malevolent interject or entity. So there's this understanding, oh my goodness, I see that you are a suffering being, and that you came in, to a suffering system. But once the parts that are attached to the suffering being are securely attached to the self, we can send it on, and we can say, look, there is hope for healing even for you. And it's your choice whether you go to the light or to the dark. But I wish the best for you. I want you even to be unburdened, right? So the only difference, maybe, again, I think unattached is the wrong word because they are attached, but they're different than other burdens that kind of seem inanimate, right? Other burdens are kind of like a big boulder, or they appear like a backpack, or maybe they're held by other people, but they're still, as in a legacy burden, but they're still this separate burden. Whereas this burden seems to be its own personality or character in some ways. But for me, that's just a small nuanced thing. It's like we can still treat it essentially like a part that's holding a burden, but it's not part of us, and we can send it out, right? And we can release it in many ways, just like we would another burden. So the classic IFS process is exactly the same. And whatever we're not afraid of in the inner system cannot harm us. So if you look at the example that I did, I continually had parts that didn't like it, were very afraid of it, and I had to really work with those and meet their concerns and let them know I'm bigger than this part and I am not afraid of it. And if they'll give me space, go in a waiting room or whatever, that I can get curious. And that's the biggest promise of it being able to stop oppressing the system, right? So they agreed to give space. So if there's enough self-energy in the system so that you're not afraid of this, particularly, these scary, malevolent entities, it's exactly the same as doing IFS. And so you could say there's no bad parts, and in some ways there's no bad entities. Like, hurt people, hurt parts, and and as we bring love and light, there's clarity and there's calm and there's confidence in the process. So if you're a practitioner, or or you're doing this on your own and you feel really fearful, don't proceed. You don't need to proceed, right, until there's calm, confident clarity there. And you might get help from someone else, or wait until there's a critical mass of self-energy. So I hope you found that interesting. I'm still, open. I am very much like Dick Schwartz and Bob Falconer, a radical pragmatist. I believe in what works. I believe in observing and not trying to make all kinds of sense out of it, but just observing what is, being completely open. And so I hope you appreciate me just sharing my experiences with you. I'm, of course, not at the end of my journey with any of this. Feel free to reach out and leave questions or comments if you would like.